Human Trafficking Awareness Month. For those of us who don't know, viewers out there, what exactly is human trafficking?
So human trafficking, as far as a general definition is concerned, is the compulsion of someone to provide labor, services, or commercial sex. And by commercial sex, I mean anything exchanged of value for sex. With respect to the legal definition of that compulsion element, that can take three different forms. It could be force, so the application of power, fraud, which is basically a word for deception, or coercion, which is essentially a psychological manipulation of someone's vulnerability.
Whenever we see it on TV, it always seems to be sex trafficking, but it
Sure.
also can include labor as well.
That's right. So sex in human trafficking, I'll just say it this way. Nationally, human trafficking predominantly takes the form of sex trafficking. However, there's a lot of labor trafficking that occurs throughout the United States too. And so that's a misnomer that many people have, that human trafficking is exclusively sex trafficking. And again, while that is more common, labor trafficking poses a significant concern too, and many people are exploited through labor trafficking as well.
We met about a year ago. How has the fight against this been the last 12 months or so?
Well, the fight against human trafficking has not gotten any easier whatsoever, especially during the pandemic. The pandemic has made it more difficult for us to both detect and also to make people aware of human trafficking, to kind of hold people accountable for human trafficking for a couple reasons. One, with kids not going to school regularly, kids in particular are uniquely vulnerable to human trafficking. And so there's no check in the system. There's no means of monitoring them in a way, especially for vulnerable populations, that there would have been if there was a regular school year, either for public or private school, frankly. And then also the very nature of the pandemic rendered more people, not just children, but adults too, vulnerable to trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Human trafficking thrives by the exploitation of some vulnerability. That vulnerability can be anything from financial problems to addiction problems to disability, homelessness. All of those things pretty much, except for disabilities, of course, got worse during the pandemic. And so in the past 12 months, we have seen some early data suggest that there was a spike in human trafficking. And all the while, folks like law enforcement agencies, and our office included, have been kind of hampered. And just in our day-to-day work capacities to spread the word about human trafficking, to help engage in investigations. So the past year has been challenging when it's come to anti-trafficking work.
I would guess that the mere fact that people are quarantining themselves and not in the public also hinders your ability to find what's going on.
That's right. I mean, detecting human trafficking requires, to some degree or another, community engagement. There's a local law enforcement component that's very vital to identifying human trafficking, detecting it, and fighting it. But there's also the tips that we receive from the public. And if folks are quarantined, if they're staying at home, which they should at different points of the year, they're not able to see and identify and draw concern from things that might be reflective of human trafficking. So it's really hampered our ability to detect it nationally and certainly in the state as well.
I'm sure a lot of people watching this are thinking, oh, it can't happen here.
Yeah, human trafficking, there's one of the misconceptions of human trafficking is that it's a urban problem. It's something that occurs in certain high density population areas or in certain sectors of society, which there's not as much of in West Virginia, and that's just wrong. Human trafficking is actually a local crime, and it can occur in your neighbor's house. It can occur with just two people, or one person really. A lot of people don't realize, for example, that a child, if a minor is prostituted, even if they're acting alone, and the person is buying sex from a minor, that purchaser is guilty of human trafficking, of sex trafficking of a child. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. And I emphasize that because children in particular are the most vulnerable victims that we see, of course, in human trafficking, and frankly, they're the most common victims. And so it's important to realize that there's everybody is at risk if they have some vulnerability that a trafficker can exploit. And it's not defined by geographical boundaries or economics or urban areas versus rural areas. But it's something that we see here in West Virginia. In fact, from the last statistics that we have available from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, it reflects that in 2019, which is the most recent data that we have, at least 93 likely victims of human trafficking were identified just from that hotline. That doesn't represent all the data we have from other law enforcement sources. This is just a nonprofit who has a hotline that people call in to identify either themselves or other people potentially as trafficking victims. In 2019, there was 93 in West Virginia that were identified as likely victims. That amount was more than the previous 2 years combined. And that's what we've seen is there's been a steady increase in the amount of victims that have been reported in West Virginia. And that might be accounted for by not necessarily that the problem is increasing, but that people are seeing it more. And so either way, it's deeply concerning. And it just reiterates that it's a problem that we have here in West Virginia, and it's something we have to pay attention to.
Speaking of seeing it more, what are some of the signs folks can be looking out for to spot human trafficking?
Certainly. Well, there's a lot of different types of signs of human trafficking. A lot of them are commonsensical, and a lot of them are based on context. But I think a good rule of thumb or a good way to look at it is to get back to this idea of vulnerability. That when someone has issues with poverty, they're in foster care, they're homeless, they have a disability, they have a history of abuse or mental problems, then they can be exploited for human trafficking. They can be manipulated to work against their will. They can be deceived. They can be forced on threat of physical punishment or extortion. And so folks who are often victims of trafficking are in a situation where they're controlled by somebody. And it may not be a physical control. In fact, there's a misunderstanding. A lot of human trafficking, people who are interested in human trafficking think that victims are shackled or chained, or that's often not the case. It's mostly not the case. The control that I talk about that human traffickers impose on their victims is very psychological. And so victims may be monitored frequently. They may not have full custody or possession of important documents to them. That might be something to look for. They may have a driver's license that somebody else holds for them, or a passport. When it comes to sex trafficking, if someone's engaged in promiscuous sexual activity or prostitution, that in of itself could be a sign of human trafficking, depending on the person. If they feel like they're doing something, especially prostitution, and they don't really want to, but they feel like they don't have a choice, that's a huge sign for human trafficking. So I think the bottom line is, when we look at signs for human trafficking, I think probably people could suspect it when they saw it, but it goes back down to the vulnerability piece, and also the basic definition. If someone either is being physically compelled or believes they're being compelled to work or to engage in prostitution, then you have human trafficking. And then when it comes to children, you don't have to have the compulsion when it comes to sex or prostitution, that is. If children are engaged in any kind of prostitution, then it's human trafficking. It's child sex trafficking. And so that has happened for a long time, and people have kind of either looked the other way or kind of looked down upon it because it's prostitution. But in reality, it's a very egregious crime.
The stereotype, again, on TV and in film is that a white van pulls up and they snatch someone. That's a big part of it, but that's certainly not the only way that happens.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because in the past year, we've seen a lot of rumors and theories, and people raise alarms about the white vans pulling up in malls and abducting children. I'm afraid there's really not a lot of evidence of that happening. Those things that we're hearing and seeing in social media, they're very often conspiracy theories that have no evidence supporting it. And it's playing on the fears and good-natured concerns that people have about human trafficking, but it really distracts people from what human trafficking actually looks like. And what it actually looks like I said, it could be a very local crime. In fact, in West Virginia, and really even nationally, one of the most common ways that people are introduced into trafficking is through their families. And most trafficking victims are trafficked by somebody they know or have some kind of relationship with. And so that's what we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned about folks who are living in our communities, who are again preying on the vulnerabilities of folks who are desperate for money, who are desperate for drugs, desperate for a home or some security, and as a result, they're being used and manipulated to either work in some kind of a traditional way or to prostitute themselves.
I was going to say the backpackers that we see in the west end of town, many of them, even though they're air quotes free to roam about on their own, they're absolutely being trafficked.
They could be, yes, absolutely. And you know, trafficking can take so many different forms. It's really hard to synthesize it and to kind of give you a simple matrix. But another increasing area of trafficking in the past few years has been from traveling sales crews. And people, you know, we've all had folks who have been selling magazines and knocked on our door, or selling cleaning products. And it's not to say that that's an illegitimate business model, that you can do that. You certainly can sell things that way and have people do that as your agents to sell products. But there have been several instances of traveling sales crew managers who have lied, manipulated young college students or high school kids to sell these products on the promise of some great prize or commission, and then not come through, and then maybe put them in an overcrowded house, and if they wanted to leave, they threatened to you know, hurt them in some way, or to take something from them, or to extort them in some way. And so that's one form of labor trafficking is that we've seen in traveling sales crews. So again, it can take a lot of different forms, both in labor trafficking and sex trafficking. But at bottom, you know, there's element of compulsion, except when you're dealing with children and prostitution, and there's this element of a vulnerability.
Is the U.S. Attorney's Office doing any special awareness because it is the Awareness Month?
We're
Any
working.
programs?
Yeah, the U.S. Attorney's Office is continuing to work with the West Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force, which we co-chair and helped to found several years ago to promote some awareness events in the month of January. Candidly, it's been bogged down because of the pandemic to do a lot of the things that we like to do, but we're trying to set up some panel discussions and informational sessions by Zoom and other similar platforms so that we can provide more information to the public about human trafficking and what we're currently seeing in West Virginia.
If folks see this and they want more information on these potential meetings, how do they do that?
So I would encourage people to check out the West Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force website, which is stophumantraffickingwv.org, I believe. And also a great resource that I recommend to everyone is a national resource. It's a nonprofit called the Polaris Project. And they have a tremendous website with a variety of resources and information to help a variety of audiences. And if they see something that gives them concern of potential trafficking, and if it's an immediate concern about somebody's safety, I would urge them to call 911. Otherwise, if it's an adult, we encourage people to call the West Virginia Fusion Center. They have an 800 number. And also, if it's in a child, to call the West Virginia Abuse and Neglect Hotline.
Anything you want to add? Anything that I missed?
No, I appreciate. I think everyone needs to recognize. Everyone needs to recognize that human trafficking is not just a national problem; it's a West Virginia problem too. And we all need to recognize that it can occur next door. It doesn't need to have a foreign national involved. It doesn't need to have interstate travel or international travel involved. It's something that can affect our neighbors or our family, and that we all need to be vigilant to make sure that no one more is victimized by this crime.